Before we start getting into how big of a problem the Iron Spider could potentially be, let's actually talk a bit about Venom himself, a character I'm sure you're all very familiar with, especially what with his recent movies. Since he was introduced in the comics back in the late 80s, the alien symbiote has unquestionably become one of Spidey's most well-known and most personal villains. Thematically, Venom is essentially a dark reflection of the idea of a human with spider-like powers, and he shares many of the Wallcrawler's abilities in almost all adaptations. He's capable of shooting webs from his body, although the current movie version simply uses shapeless tendrils, can crawl on walls much like Spidey himself, and definitely is not lacking in sheer strength, making whoever he's currently attached to much stronger than usual. Which is a real doozy when you're dealing with a human who already has the proportionate strength of a spider. While the majority of audiences are probably most aware of Venom's slightly reworked origin from the 90s animated series, which heavily influenced all later takes on the character, Venom actually used to be a somewhat benign parasite in the comics, at least until he began taking Peter's body for nightly joyrides to fight crime, which caused our boy quite a bit of fatigue. It wasn't until Spider-Man rejected the symbiote and it bonded with Eddie Brock, who already had a grudge against the web-slinger, that it began to turn fully villainous and became defined by its hatred of Peter and his heroic alter ego. And like I said, in most adaptations, that's what makes the Venom symbiote so dangerous. That it not only knows Peter's identity, but knows him on a much more personal level than even most of his other longtime villains. After all, it literally shared a mind with him at one point and became fully intent on ruining every part of his life. But now that we've briefly covered Venom, let's go through the various suits Peter has had in the MCU, and take a look at how they just keep getting more and more powerful, culminating with the Iron Spider. Through Spider-Man's more than a half-a-century-long superhero career, he probably takes the crown as the one superhero to have worn the most different outfits. There are the homemade ones he creates at the beginning of his career, the suits he gets once he joins other teams, any number of alternate universe versions of himself and various clones, or the high-tech armors he ends up with once he gets to know people like Tony Stark, which happened pretty quickly in the MCU in particular. The difference is that this time, Spidey's suit came with a training wheels program that locked out apparently literally hundreds of web shooter combinations and other technological advances. Stark's original intent was for Spidey to gradually unlock this as he grew more experienced and could handle more responsibility, in order to eventually grow into a stable and very powerful hero. Too bad it didn't quite turn out this way because Peter, being Peter, hacked into it easily the instant he realized it was there and unlocked everything all at once. Not that that turned out super well for him, but still. If Peter, who, while he is admittedly a genius, is still a pretty young and inexperienced crime fighter, can hack into Tony's tech, then there's no telling how many villains out there can do so as well, possibly even remotely. And I mean, it's not like Tony's stuff doesn't already have a bit of a nasty habit of getting stolen, hacked, or otherwise taken over. And that's not even counting the possibility of it going rogue on its own. To keep going down the list of tech Peter has or have had access to that could cause any amount of trouble, we might need to also take a look at two particular interfaces, Karen and Edith. You probably remember Karen as the AI that controlled the functions in the first suit and was meant to keep an eye on Peter and make sure he finished the training wheels protocol. But just try to stop and think about that for a minute. Helpful as Karen was, that means that an AI existed that could control every gadget or weapon installed within the suit, including things like X-ray vision and drone technology. And given that Karen was shown to store information that Peter gathered on his adventures, she likely also had access to databases hosting rather sensitive details on many of Peter's loved ones, and possibly even on the Avengers as well. Now granted, the suit was destroyed, and presumably so was Karen with it, but that doesn't mean Tony didn't have some kind of backup function installed back when he was still around. It's entirely possible that there's still some version of Karen's code floating around in a hard drive in some secret Stark vault somewhere. And let's not forget Edith, who was way more than just a stylish pair of glasses. This program granted the wearer access to the Stark Industries' arsenal of drones, missiles, and various satellites. There's a good reason this thing was the center of the entire conflict with Mysterio after all, and I mean, just look at how much destruction it caused. And unlike Karen, Edith was never actually destroyed, and it's likely that Peter still has the glasses somewhere, even if he doesn't use them. The point is, Peter has access to at least one, potentially two systems that both have control over a lot of weapons. And it doesn't stop there, because we still have one more suit to take a look at, the Iron Spider. After all, as powerful as the old suit and its upgraded far from home version were, they were still just that. Suits. Something that would actually need a body to wear them to even be mobile in the first place, which does at least alleviate some of the problems brought up so far. But the Iron Spider armor that Peter was wearing during the Infinity War could prove to be a much bigger problem. This thing's introduction was where Spidey did basically kind of become Iron Man Jr., as some viewers have derisively called him, and ended up equipped with even more ways to do some very serious damage. Along with the capabilities of the former suits, the Iron Spider has many more weapons, including missiles and those 4 robotic spider legs that seem to be able to act almost entirely independently of Peter in order to deal with the dangers around them. And oh yes, I believe there was also a little feature in that suit that had a very reassuring name somewhere along the lines of Instant Kill Mode. You know, that setting Peter used against the Outriders during the battle against Thanos? Those might have been mindless beasts, which is the only way someone as gentle as Peter would ever use a feature like that, but once it was activated, the suit became downright scary. Those metallic legs of his seemed to have very little issue immediately impaling anything that came a little too close for comfort, regardless of Peter's own reactions to the danger. Yes, it was only brought out in an extreme situation, and we all know Peter himself would never utilize it any differently, but that doesn't change that this is still an extremely dangerous suit, or that it can be controlled remotely and deployed by an AI, more specifically Friday, who also had control over Tony's armors. So that means that by now we have a whole lot of advanced Spider-Man weaponry all in the hands of 2 to 3 AIs, Karen, Edith, and Friday, which were all created by the same person, who already owns a large collection of remote-controlled power armors. And that's more than a little bit worrying. Let's not pretend that Tony Stark, or really any super scientist dabbling in AI in any comic book universe, has the cleanest track record when it comes to their creations staying on the side of angels, or even being particularly obedient. I mean, even if we only stick to the MCU, does anyone remember Ultron? He was barely activated for a day before he decided that all of humanity desperately needed to die. And we've already seen and briefly discussed what happens when the wrong person gets control over a bit of intelligent machinery that does do its job correctly. Whether it be through the AI growing sentient and gradually being corrupted over time, or some villain out there finding a way to steal or hack into any of these systems, there's very, very little that keeps these AIs from turning evil in one way or another. And while nobody doubts that Tony was a genius, he was still human, and humans have habits, even within the things they create. Should a flaw exist within one of these creations that someone else can exploit to gain control of it, it's very likely that a similar flaw exists within the others, or that one AI will have the means to communicate with or even hack into another. Just try and imagine the kind of ripple effect that could occur once someone got a hold of just one of Stark's inventions this way. It's honestly rather scary. So with all of Peter's equipment and the many ways all of it could potentially become extremely dangerous if it falls into the wrong hands, let's consider just how many wrong hands are actually out there. The short answer is there are a lot of them. Tony attracts jealous tech manufacturers with agendas like picnics attract ants in the MCU, with even Spidey's own enemies so far largely turning to villainy because of grudges against Stark Industries. Even outside of Tony and his various rivals and enemies, the Marvel Universe is absolutely crawling with super scientists, not all of whom have the purest of intentions. And Peter has already managed to tick quite a few of them off. We know that the Tinkerer is still around for one, and Toomes definitely has a lot of interest in getting his claws on as many weapons as possible to send Peter's way. And if we start digging into the comics, then whoo boy! The line practically goes around the block. Now, we still need to see how No Way Home turns out and whether or not people will end up actually permanently forgetting about Peter's secret identity. But if his name remains public and the manhunt continues, who's to say that characters like Alistair and Spencer Smythe couldn't appear somewhere down the line in future MCU stories? These two already have a history in the comics of building robots literally called Spider Slayers or wearing bug-themed power armor, so why wouldn't they see some potential in hacking into the Iron Spider suit? And while this next one is probably very unlikely since their Raimi trilogy counterparts will appear in the latest movie, there could still be MCU versions of Otto Octavius and Norman Osborn out there to pull a scheme like this. Not that I'm really counting on most of these things actually happening, mind you, but my point is, there's no shortage of really wicked people out there who could do a lot of very, very serious damage if they found some way to control the Iron Spider, assuming it wouldn't go rogue on its own. And if the Iron Spider does run amok at some point, Spidey might have some real trouble deactivating the damn thing since Tony is gone, guys. He's not here anymore. He practically started the MCU's legacy of superheroes and then gave his life in the ultimate sacrifice to save the universe from Thanos. And while, yes, Endgame did see a lot of snapped characters return to life, the MCU isn't like the comics where being dead is basically just the equivalent of being benched until the next game. He's gonna stay gone, which is where the next problem would come in should an evil Iron Spider suddenly appear. Basically, there's no real guarantee that Peter would have a real proper way to shut it off. I've already said it once, but let's say it one more time. Peter is unquestionably brilliant. This is even one of the few continuities where his intelligence is properly rewarded by going to a school where his keen scientific mind has been allowed to flourish. But no matter how brilliant he is, he has still so far very much been a trainee under Tony until he died. For all of Peter's amazing heroics, he's not the most confident person around, and despite having once hacked the original Stark suit, it wouldn't be entirely unlike him to consider high-tier Stark tech so similar to the actual Iron Man suits to be too advanced for him to be able to break into or find a peaceful way to shut it down. Especially not if it has been corrupted or someone else has tampered with it enough to make it different from the usual suit. The one who knows Tony's tech the best is Tony himself, and even if there is some way to bypass a lot of what the suit can do or get it back under control, he isn't around anymore to tell Peter how, or even just to help him figure it out. But then again, we have seen Peter take on people wearing powerful battle armor before with little more than his wit and his own homemade web shooters, so it's not impossible. And I'm sure it would be an awesome spectacle. But the whole reason we started this discussion of just how dangerous the Iron Spider suit is and how much of a problem it would be if it went rogue was because the post-credit scene in Venom 2 has made it pretty clear that the symbiote has now officially arrived in the MCU. So if we're gonna claim that the Iron Spider is even deadlier than Venom is, we have to actually take a proper look at how dangerous they both are respectively. In terms of sheer power, the two are actually very different in what they're able to do. The Venom symbiote is an organic being dependent on attaching itself to a human host in order to unlock most of its abilities, which might be a bit of a hindrance if we assume that the Iron Spider gained the ability to move on its own. Not that it seems there's gonna be much trouble getting Venom and Eddie to stick together though. Those two couldn't be any closer after the ordeal they went through with Carnage. But it is a caveat that the possibly remote-controlled Iron Spider suit wouldn't necessarily have to deal with. Venom also has his share of easily exploitable weaknesses. In particular, he doesn't exactly deal super well with fire or sound-based attacks. It's probably pretty safe to assume that among the aforementioned 500 web combinations and the missiles the Iron Spider can fire, at least one or two will have some kind of thermal aspect to them. And I really wouldn't be surprised to see a couple of sonic grenades in its arsenal as well. The Iron Spider's weaknesses, if it has any, are likely somewhat more difficult to deal with. Venom's abilities do stretch far and wide for certain, but he usually makes for a more direct, close quarters, one-on-one kind of confrontation. This gives Spider-Man a single opponent to worry about, rather than the potential barrage of missiles and other weapons that the Iron Spider could throw at him. And while this version of the symbiote is clearly intelligent and very observant, the Iron Spider would likely either be controlled by some kind of mad super scientist, or, scarier still, by the aforementioned Friday AI. And there's just no way that these two bumbling loons can compete with that kind of processing power. And as already mentioned, one of the things that usually makes Venom so absolutely deadly in various adaptations is that he knows Peter. He doesn't just know Peter's name or where he lives or simple facts like that any villain could potentially one day find out, and all of which is common knowledge in the MCU at the moment anyway. He was literally a part of Peter once and knows how he thinks, what he fears, and how to press all of his buttons. This version of Venom, however, has never actually been bonded with Peter before, and instead had Eddie from the start. And Eddie, in turn, is a somewhat more heroic character than the dirty reporter he used to be in the original Marvel comics, and has no beef with Peter, not even having known about him in his old universe. So it's not like I'm saying that the symbiote couldn't be a threat, not at all, but one of its biggest advantages and motivators regarding antagonizing Peter has been completely removed in this adaptation, which knocks a few points off its threat level. The Iron Spider, in turn, likely has access to a database with information not just on Peter, but on many of his friends and allies as well. So even if Dr. Strange's spell ends up working and most people forget who Spider-Man is, it would still be possible for whoever claims control of the Iron Spider to target everyone Peter cares about. Or even other superheroes that could otherwise come to his aid. So honestly, with Venom's usual edge having been taken out of the equation, the point seems to go to the Iron Spider regarding who would be the bigger threat. But there's no accounting for the unpredictable ferocity of the Venom symbiote either. Of course, this entire video is all speculation, and most of the things we've discussed probably won't happen. But it is rather interesting to think about.